Thank you everybody for being here tonight with us. We're going to spend the next hour talking about the impacts of childhood trauma. And I'll start really briefly with a little introduction of myself. As Caitlin said, I'm an assistant professor in human development at the WSU Vancouver campus. And there I am the director of the Healthy Emotional Development Lab. So we study some of the things that we're going to talk about tonight, as well as sort of healthy emotional development in early life, prenatal development, how the relationship between the parent and the child, even before they're born and then across the first few years of life, really shape how children fare both mentally and physically as they grow up. So I'll take this moment to a little tiny plug that if you or somebody you know is in the Vancouver area, the Clark County area, and would like to know more about the work that we do or to get involved in research in any way, please do send me an email, get in touch. We are always interested in spreading the word about the research that we're doing and also getting students and community members involved in the work that we have going on. So the very last slide of my presentation tonight will have my email address on it, so do jot that down if you're interested. Okay, so briefly, what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to start by really just defining what childhood trauma is and what it looks like. And then we're going to talk a lot about how childhood trauma is linked to health outcomes. Sort of what do we know? What are the main studies in this area? What does that mean for us? And then, of course, talking about how do we prevent childhood trauma in the first place, and how do we help trauma-exposed children or those who have trauma in their own, history. Maybe they're adults now, but they have trauma in their history. So what I'd like to do, though, is really start with a note of warning. So obviously, these are not topics and issues that are easy to think about, hear about, talk about. And many of us who are drawn to this work and who might be attending this webinar tonight have a real connection to the topic of childhood trauma, either personally and or professionally, right? So either we or someone we know has trauma in their history or experiencing trauma, or we work with families, or we are planning to work with families who are experiencing or have experienced trauma. So particularly when we have our own sort of scars around this topic coming from our own past, it can really challenging to engage with this material, with this issue, and yet at the same time, I think really powerful and important and healing to learn, to educate, to think about what we can do to overcome and to heal these wounds. So I just want to put it out there and call it out and ask you guys to really take care of yourselves tonight and tomorrow and every day around these issues, and do what you need to do, especially if you have your own scars from trauma and your own history. Really do whatever it is that you need to do to kind of feel safe and take care of yourself around the stuff we're going to talk about tonight. We're going to start with a sort of straightforward definition of what childhood trauma is. And this comes from the National Institute of Mental Health, the NIMH. And they describe childhood trauma as an experience of an emotionally painful or distressing event that results in lasting mental and physical effects. So, somewhat of a useful definition, but I think it hints at what's really important, that this is a difficult event that happens in childhood and that it has an impact on the child's development. So it has lasting effects on both mental and physical health. And we're going to unpack tonight a little bit of sort of why does that happen? Why is it that trauma has these long-lasting effects on our health? And to do that, we have to really start by thinking about how the parent-child relationship has evolved, and sort of humans in general have evolved in this way such that, especially in the first few years of life, the primary caregiver, whether that's mom, dad, grandparent, adoptive parent, foster family, whoever that is, the person or people who are providing the primary care for the child really is acting as sort of the child's regulatory system, or their set of coping strategies and coping skills, kind of an external coping mechanism, this this, the way that the caregiver responds to the child and sort of structures the child's world and responds to the child when they're distressed and helps the child cope with and recover from small and large sort of upsets or distressing events is really the way that we evolved as a species, and is really critical to the child being able to have that sort of healthy developmental process. So when the caregiver-child relationship is not secure, is not a safe place for the child to go to be held, to be comforted, to feel safe, to feel secure, to have those difficult situations kind of processed and soothed and made okay again, the child really doesn't have, especially early in life, the ability to cope with those kinds of difficult, really extremely emotionally painful or distressing events on their own. And I mean this in a behavioral sense, and that if we think of, a baby or a young child, they don't have a lot of coping strategies, especially, in the first year of life. They can't kind of escape negative situations very well. They don't have language yet, so they can't articulate what's going on with them very well. They really need caregivers who are very tuned in, very present, and very there to make sure that the child is safe and secure. So I mean that behaviorally, but I also mean that young children don't have the neural development. They don't have the brain development or the brain architecture in place yet. And the brain, of course, talks to the whole rest of the body, right? So when I say the brain development, I'm talking about systems throughout the body in terms of stress response systems, hormones like cortisol that you've probably heard of that gets released when we're experiencing stress, the activation of things like the immune system that can get triggered when we are sick, but also when we are experiencing other kinds of trauma. And so this whole the brain and the way that the brain organizes the entire body, the physiology or the biology of children's reactions to stress and traumatic events is not sort of online, so to speak. It's not sophisticated enough to be able to cope with really difficult things. And so traumatic events overwhelm the child's ability to cope. It overwhelms the biology of the child's ability to cope with these situations. So, and I want to pause because I don't remember if Caitlin said this or not, but if there are questions that arise that are, like sort of basic clarification questions, I use a term that's not clear or something like that, then I am happy to stop and clarify as we go along. And then my plan is to leave plenty of time at the end to answer your questions, to have more of a kind of whatever, sort of different direction we might want to go in question and answer there at the end. But if there is a term that I use that people are not familiar with, please do use your chat function, and hopefully Caitlin can jump in and bring my attention to any kinds of clarifying questions that I can answer. Okay, so we're starting to think of, starting to get a handle on why it is that really difficult, emotionally evocative, scary things that happen in early childhood have such a big impact. It's because the child doesn't have all of the brain architecture and physiological skills, as well as the cognitive skills, to really be able to cope and make sense of these things. I mean, even as adults, traumatic events are traumatic. They have long-lasting effects, right? We can develop a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder as an adult, but as a child, we really are not armed with the biology as well as the cognition and the emotion to cope with these things. And the thing that makes it so potent in early childhood is, as we're going to talk about again in just a minute, when we experience trauma, when we have our coping mechanisms overwhelmed and completely kind of flooded and overpowered by negative things that happen, it affects the way that those processes, brain architecture, and the rest of the biology of stress and coping, it changes the way that those things actually develop. So that's how we start to understand these long-term or lasting effects, is that we actually change how the developmental process is happening early in life. And that, of course, is going to have all of these downstream effects as well. So I want to talk a little bit about what the trauma-exposed child really looks like, or the child who has experienced trauma. Like how does that manifest in terms of behavior and things like that? So common kind of symptoms of a child who has been exposed to trauma include things like sudden extreme emotional responses or the inability to calm down or to control emotions. So this makes perfect sense given what I was just saying, that the young child depends on the caregiver to help them cope with trauma, or to help them cope with any kind of difficult or upsetting things, from, the crying and fussing that I'm hungry or I need my diaper changed, all the way to something much more extreme. The young child is really reliant on the caregiver to know what those needs are and to meet those needs, to soothe the child, to help them. That's how they learn how to control or regulate their emotions, is by the experience of the caregiver sort of regulating their emotions for them. So the child who has experienced trauma, who has had overwhelmingly distressing events and did not have the caregiver to help them cope with that and learn how to manage it, sort of somewhat understandably ends up in a place where they have extreme emotional responses and they don't know how to calm down, or they don't know how to control them. They're not developing those abilities to regulate themselves that kids typically are doing across this age span. There may be aggressive or violent behavior, lashing out, and again, an inability to control behavior, a lack of impulse control, or an inability to think about consequences. And children who have been exposed to trauma often are described as sort of acting spacey or zoning out, an inability to focus their attention, especially in the classroom, where the teachers are expecting them to sort of sit and focus and complete a task. The teachers often will describe children as zoning out, spacing out. Maybe these are sometimes the kinds of behaviors that we might associate with sort of raising a red flag for something like attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, or ADD, attention deficit disorder. So the lack of ability to control their impulses, they're spacing out, they're not paying attention. And that is consistent with a child who has ADD. It's also consistent with a child who has been exposed to trauma. And the thing about children's behavior, the thing about development, is that a child's behavior always makes sense, always is adaptive, like it has a logical function if you understand where the child is coming from. So for a child who is living in a home, say, where there's violence, and maybe the violence is occurring between the adults in the home, maybe it is actually occurring, perpetrated on the child, regardless, the child is growing up in a home where there is regular violence. And so the aggressive or violent lashing out makes a lot of sense for a child who is sort of constantly on edge, constantly hypervigilant, constantly having to feel like they have to monitor their environment all the time for safety, right? Because bad things are happening. They don't know when they're going to happen. They can't control how they're going to happen. They can't keep themselves safe. They can't get out of the situation. And oftentimes in these sorts of relationships, the caregivers, or these sorts of families, the caregivers, the people who are supposed to be that safe haven, or that, that safety zone of sort of keeping the child safe and secure, are either not available to keep the child safe and secure because they are themselves experiencing violence perpetrated against them, or maybe most tragically, they are the causes of the violence. They are the causes of the trauma, of the really, really overwhelmingly scary stuff that's happening. It's actually coming from the caregiver. So the child not only doesn't have that safe haven, but that safe haven is actually the source of the fear and the trauma. So when you think about that, then, and we think about what I was just describing in terms of the child, the overwhelming emotional distress of these traumatic events, overwhelming and changing the brain architecture and the way that biology is developing, the biological, physiological systems within the child, then things like a lack of impulse control or the inability to think about consequences is really a direct result of the child needing to act in the moment and to potentially to keep themselves safe or to get their needs met. And these changes in brain architecture that we see, these changes in specifically the prefrontal cortex, so the place where we do a lot of the sort of executive functions, as we call them. Things like acting spacey or zoning out can often be a sign of what we call dissociation. So when a traumatic event has occurred, one of the ways that adults and children alike may cope with that is to distance themselves psychologically from that event. Sort of, people describe it as kind of like being outside of their body and just watching a bad thing happening to them. And it's because it's so awful to be in your body and to be experiencing that. There's so little control. It's so terrifying that it's actually a very adaptive, like useful strategy for children to create that separation, to dissociate, and to be sort of outside of the experience, watching it rather than living in that terror in that moment. Each of these things, so each of these behaviors, when we see it from that perspective, we can see how it has a very important, useful function for helping children survive as best they can traumatic events. Now, of course, when the child is in the school setting or the child is with peers or something like that outside of that, say, violent home, that's when these behaviors that made a lot of sense and actually probably were really useful for the child in that home environment now get them into trouble, right? Now that strategy that they use of spacing out or checking out or zoning out that sort of prevented them from feeling the overwhelming terror when they were in this violent situation at home, now gets them into trouble at school, and they're accused of, not paying attention, of not, working hard, these kinds of things. So I think it's really important to recognize, what these behaviors can look like, because we don't always think about children's difficulties at school through a trauma lens, from the perspective of, could these be the result of traumatic experiences in the home? And I think we can have a lot more sort of understanding about what it is that the child is trying to do and what's going on when we recognize that these are not just sort of negative behaviors that have to be overcome. That's true to some extent. You can't be violent. You can't be having these extreme reactions that you can't calm down. Like, you're not going to be able to be successful in school and moving forward if you have those things. But they served a really important purpose, or they came very logically from what the child was experiencing in, say, that home or in that traumatic situation in the first place.
Excuse me, Dr. Waters, there is a clarification question. What age group are you describing that display these trauma-exposed behaviors?
Well, so I've been talking about the example of going into school, right? Now, the things like emotional responses that can't be calmed down, things like lack of impulse control, and even being spacey or sort of being checked out, these are things that we can see even in infancy. So the behaviors are, but of course, there's a certain amount of extreme emotional responses or not being able to control oneself in infancy that are just normal developmental, sort of where you are, right? Like in your normative developmental trajectory. And so the way to think about this is that it's a lack of impulse control, or if it's a lack of being able to regulate emotions, that kids typically should be able to do at that age. Right. And so the emotion regulation of a 2-year-old is obviously always going to be much less sophisticated than the emotional regulation of a 7-year-old. And at the same time, there's going to be evidence of a lack of the regulation that a 2-year-old should be at in a 2-year-old that has been exposed to trauma, and similarly a lack of the emotion regulation that a 7-year-old should be at in a 7-year-old who has been exposed to trauma. So I hope that kind of gets at the answer. So that gets at the question. So there's really to some extent, these behaviors really become obvious when kids get to school, right? So by 5, 6, 7, like when they enter school, that's when it really becomes an issue, because that's when you have like teachers saying, hey, the kid can't sit still. Hey, the kid doesn't pay attention. Hey, the kid's getting into fights with other kids, right? But these kinds of the effects of the trauma on the developing child are happening before that. And so there's a developmentally shifted version of those behaviors that are emerging even in infants, toddlers, preschoolers before they get to school as well. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to do was check in and see how many of you are familiar with this term ACEs, or have, some exposure or experience already with this idea of ACEs. Okay, so a bunch of you guys are writing in, and it really is pretty split. One of you says, oh, I have, or I've written a research paper on it already, and then the next person says, never heard of it, or totally unfamiliar. Okay, so what we're going to talk about next is a review for some of you guys, but it also sounds like it'll be new for many of you as well, or sort of a refresher, or maybe something that you've been introduced to, and so you have some familiarity with it. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and the idea of ACEs is that it captures sort of 10 events that may or may not have happened to you during childhood, that are representative of the kinds of traumatic events that we see predicting long-term negative health outcomes, mental and physical health outcomes. So this, we like the abbreviation of ACEs really stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and here are the 10. Now, this is not to say that these 10 things are the only things that can be traumatic events in childhood. That's certainly not the case, and these are things that are experienced in sort of normative populations. So obviously something like living in through a war, or being a refugee, or something like that, losing your caregivers, having your caregivers die, are definitely traumatic events that could happen, or adverse childhood experiences. They're not on this list. This list is really meant to capture kind of the more, I don't know, I don't want to call them like common or regular kinds of adversities or traumas, but in a certain way they are, as we'll see the statistics in just a minute. So all kinds of child maltreatment fall into adverse childhood experiences, whether that's physical abuse, emotional abuse, or sexual abuse, as well as neglect. And they break that out into emotional neglect, so feeling unloved and unsupported during your childhood, as well as physical neglect, so not having enough food, clothing, shelter, things like that. And then there are things like caregiver divorce. And so I say caregiver here, meaning that parents, not limiting to just parents, right? So a divorce between your primary caregivers, a violence against the caregiver, so specifically violence against your female caregiver, whether that's your mom or your stepmom or whoever that is, caregiver substance abuse, caregiver mental illness, and I really mean pretty severe mental illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and unregulated, unmedicated, untreated mental illness, and then caregiver incarceration. And so if you look at this list of events, these 10 experiences that can happen, and I should say that the way that we think about adverse childhood experiences, the way that we measure them, and I'm going to talk about some research that measures adverse childhood experiences right now, the way that we measure them is that we ask adults to think back on their childhood. and answer a series of kind of yes/no questions around whether each of these things happened to them. And so it'll involve a description of, during my childhood, I felt unloved or uncared for, like I didn't matter to my mom or dad, to the people who took care of me, the adults who took care of me. And if you answer yes, then that would sort of flag that you had experienced emotional neglect. And so it's really your recollection of these things happening during your childhood. And we can talk more about what that means as a way of measuring child trauma or child adversity as well. So what you'll see here on this list of 10 is really violations of or ruptures to or threats to that caregiver-child relationship, right? So this idea of child trauma happens when something really hard, difficult, upsetting happens to the child and they don't have their caregiver to really help them manage that. So if the caregiver is perpetrating abuse or neglect, then clearly the caregiver is not a safe haven, is not a safe place for the child to go to be soothed and comforted and helped sort of manage those experiences. And then on the other side, other things that can really make the caregiver unavailable to the child, whether that's divorce, whether that's addiction, whether that's mental illness, whether that's they're completely, they're not present because they're in prison, or they're so terrified by their own experiences when there's violence against the caregiver that they're not able to be present for the child because they're traumatized themselves, and so they can't, be a safe haven for somebody else when they're completely overwhelmed by their own traumatic experiences. So these are the adverse childhood experiences, and it's really like we just sort of go down the list and people, of how many of these you've experienced. So it could be anywhere from 0 to 10. And if we look at the original ACE survey, which was of 17,000 Californians in San Diego, California, I think, the breakdown is something like this. So roughly 38% of the people who participated in this original study reported that they had not experienced any of those 10 adversities. 21% of people reported that they had experienced one of those. You can imagine that often that is caregiver divorce. 14% reported they had experienced 2, 10% 3, and then another 17% had experienced 4 or more ACEs. And we lump together 4 plus, 4 or more, for a couple of reasons. One, so we think of this as risk begets risk. When you have experienced 1 or 2 of these, especially at least 2 or 3, it really increases your risk or the likelihood that you will experience more of them as well. And 4 really seems to be kind of a tripping point so that when you have experienced 4 or more, like you're much more likely to have experienced a lot more, closer to 10, right? So if we go back and we look at that list, you can imagine that physical abuse and emotional abuse, for instance, often co-occur. Right? You can imagine that caregiver mental illness and caregiver substance abuse often co-occur, and that whether it's for a variety of reasons. You can imagine that violence against the caregiver and caregiver incarceration can co-occur, that a caregiver who is suffering from untreated mental illness or substance abuse addiction is much more likely to be at risk for neglect as well. So this is what I mean by risk begets risk. So as we start to add up the ACEs, we get much more likely to have experienced even more of those ACEs. The other reason that we say 4 plus is because when we look at the relationship between ACEs and health outcomes, there's sort of a tipping point where 4 or more ACEs is worse than 3 ACEs, and 3 ACEs is worse than 2, and 2 ACEs is worse than 1, and 1 ACE is worse than 0. But once you get to 4 or more, we don't see significant differences in terms of your risk for negative health outcomes associated with each of those additional ACEs. There's kind of a like a threshold effect almost. Okay, so here are just the prevalence rates from that first study from 1998, and you might think like, okay, that was 20 years ago. Have things gotten better? Have things gotten worse? What might this look like? Here are the prevalence rates from a survey of almost 7,500 Washingtonians that was done in 2009. So not completely current, but about whatever that puts us, like 10 years ago or so, 9 years ago. And what we see is strikingly similar percentages of individuals reporting 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4, right? Like those look like they could be from the same population, even though they're from totally different places, different people, and a decade or more apart. So, and I could show you, these kinds of pie charts from other surveys in other parts of the country, and you'd see fairly similar kind of breakdown. So, the tragedy of this is just how many people have experienced childhood trauma, right? If you look at the orange, yellow, green, and blue, almost 2/3 of people who are reporting in these studies have experienced at least one, if not multiple, childhood traumas, and that's pretty sobering. The other side of that story is that if we are people who fall into those orange, yellow, green, or blue slices of the pie, we are far from alone. And one of the things that I think is really easy to feel when you have experienced trauma is a great sense of self-blame, a great sense of shame, a great sense of what is wrong with me that I have such a hard time dealing with fill in the blank, whatever aspect of adult life that I'm struggling with. Why is it so hard for me? Why do I struggle with depression or anxiety? Why do I have this issue and that issue? Like, what did I do wrong? What is wrong with me? And that's very isolating, to think that there's something wrong with you, that you caused this, that you're somehow to blame, that your traumatic past, the things that happened in your family are somehow uniquely awful. And the truth is, there are a lot of people who have experienced childhood trauma. There are a lot of people who have experienced ACEs. There are a lot of us sort of all in the same boat around trying to figure out how to heal and how to have the best lives that we can given our traumatic history. And so I think in some ways there's some hope in that when we look at figures like this, and we look at how 2/3 of these samples, and like I said, I could show you a pie chart of national surveys that very similarly fall in that 2/3 of people are reporting at least one ACE, if not more. We are far from alone. This is, in fact, arguably an epidemic, right? This is more common than not to be, as adults, figuring out how to cope with these things from our childhood. Now, if we dig into this study from 1998, the first author on this research paper is Felitti. So Felitti et al., Felitti and lots of other people worked on this paper. 17,000 adults, they reported on their ACEs. Like I had described, they were asked to think back on your childhood. Did this kind of thing happen to you? Yes or no? Did that kind of thing happen to you? Yes or no? And then the people in this study gave the researchers access to their medical records. And so the researchers were able to look at the relationship between people who had reported ACEs, how many ACEs they had reported, and a whole host of mental and physical health outcomes that had been diagnosed by medical professionals. So we weren't just asking people like, do you feel depressed or do you have depression? We were actually looking at their medical records. I mean, they did that too. They asked people to report on their own health, but they were also able to look at medical records for physical health diagnoses. So you see here in this figure that I have a bunch on, across the bottom, we have a bunch of negative health outcomes, having a BMI over 35, which is considered obese, morbidly obese, having a diagnosis of diabetes, of cancer, of heart disease, of stroke, of chronic lung disease. So these are all physical health outcomes. And then as well, some things that we would more consider mental health outcomes, things like depression, alcoholism, or having a suicide attempt in your history. And what I'm going to show you is the odds of having any of these things in your medical records if you have 4 or more ACEs compared to if you have 0 ACEs. So again, I was describing how those are the two. So 0 ACEs, kind of those who have no trauma or adversity, versus that group of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, people who fall anywhere in that 4 or more. And so we see that if you do have 4 or more ACEs, your odds of having morbid obesity is almost 2 times higher than if you have 0. Similar rate for diabetes, a little bit more for cancer, a little bit higher for heart disease, similar for stroke, your odds are almost 4 times as great for lung disease. And this figure was really incredible for those of us who study trauma, because it really drove home the fact that the effects of trauma are not just mental, they're not just psychological, they're physical. There are things happening in the body as a result of early exposure to adversity, early trauma, that change people's trajectories and elevate their risk for what you see here are a lot of the main killers in this country, right? And certainly of the sort of long-term chronic disease, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and COPD, or chronic lung disease, are long-term chronic illnesses that cause a lot of suffering, right? And then if we turn to the mental health diagnosis side, we see similar rates for depression, even greater for alcoholism, and almost the odds of having a suicide attempt in your history, if you have 4 or more ACEs, is almost 12 times greater than if you have no ACEs in your history. So it was this study 20 years ago now that it was published that really got people thinking, okay, there's something to this. There really is something about adverse childhood experiences or early trauma that is influencing health and well-being, physical and mental health across the lifespan, because these people were, when they participated in this study, were middle-aged or older. So this was, decades of time between the adversities that they were reporting they had experienced and when they received these health diagnoses. This sort of pyramid sketch right here is what we often use to describe sort of how we are conceptualizing how this is happening. What is going on? And so at the bottom of the pyramid, you see, or the triangle, I guess, you see adverse childhood experiences. So having adversities and multiple adversities or multiple traumas in your childhood, because you can see that arrow starts at conception. So right from the beginning, having trauma exposure. We could do another whole talk on the prenatal environment and how what goes on in the prenatal environment shapes the child after they're born. But adverse childhood experiences change neurodevelopment and disrupt neurodevelopment. The sort of optimal pathways for development are less likely to happen as you have experienced more trauma and adversity. So this is that brain architecture and the physiology and the biology associated with that I was talking about. So when we have changes in the brain architecture and the physiology associated with that, those lead to changes in our social, emotional, and cognitive functioning. So this is this idea that as we have experienced trauma that we're unable to cope with and regulate well, our stress response system in our bodies become changed, become tuned to these experiences of overwhelming distress. And that has effects on our neuroendocrine system, so our hormones, things like cortisol, that has effects on our immune system. So we're more likely to experience greater inflammation and inflammatory diseases because of changes in the way that the immune system develops. It changes the development of the prefrontal cortex, where things like executive function are really the prefrontal cortex is key for the development of executive function. So when we impair or disrupt the development there, we're going to see effects on planning and impulse control and delayed gratification and decision making and things like that. So when we have these changes, then from there we see a greater likelihood of behaviors that are risky, whether that is, drugs, alcohol, unprotected sex, just risky behaviors in terms of, driving unsafely and things like that, getting into fights, things like that. That certainly increase disease, disability, and social problems, and those are the things that feed into early death. So the research of sort of understanding how it is that trauma changes neurodevelopment and how that is then linked to behavior, this is where sort of like the cutting edge science and research really is. So things that I mentioned, like cortisol or the immune system, those studies are emerging. We have good evidence from animal models of what it is that's going on. It's much easier to test these kinds of things in animals where we can do things like remove an infant monkey from its caregiver and look at what that does to the physiology, the biology, and the brain architecture of the monkey over time. The ethics of that is a whole nother conversation, but currently that is part of what we can do ethically, scientifically, to understand these things. And then certainly like in rats or mice or something like that, we are able to do a lot of sort of trying to isolate what it is that's going on. Because of course the end goal is, if we can understand these things, can we change them? Can we reverse them, right? Can we figure out how to sort of stop people from moving up this triangle once they've had those experiences? And what I want to shift to, though, of course, is that ideally we would not have childhood trauma, we would not have adverse childhood experiences at the rate that we do in the first place, right? And so childhood trauma is really the result of ruptures in multiple systems. I am a firm believer that virtually without exception, parents love their children and want to provide for them and to do their best by them. And when abuse and neglect, when maltreatment happens, when there's violence in the home, when there's substance use in the home, it is the result of many failures or problems are with the supports that the family receives, the access to healthcare, on and on and on, that sort of allow these cracks or these ruptures and these traumatic events to happen. And so to prevent childhood trauma, we really have to take action across these multiple systems. This is, yes, of course, it is about helping parents develop better coping skills, educating parents about resources and about sort of healthy parenting and the risk for physical abuse, say, that comes with harsh physical punishment. But it also has to come from the healthcare system, from communities, from schools, from, like, these are what I mean by multiple levels of the system. And so I want to say that we're really fortunate that in Washington State, we have an example of this multiple systems being tackled at once to prevent childhood trauma. in this Essentials for Childhood initiative. And it involves educating people about brain science and ACEs and resilience. Not unlike this webinar tonight, it involves transforming systems and services to mitigate the impact of trauma, so having trauma-informed care in early childhood, in schools, in pediatricians' offices, in all the touch points for families in the community. It's about helping build community ownership and impact. So helping, because one of the big ruptures in the system that allows for child maltreatment to occur is the lack of social support and the social isolation that is so common. Is that people have nowhere to go and they're overwhelmed and chronically stressed and at their breaking point, and there's nobody there to give them a little bit of relief, right? And to bring together family-centered services around so that they're connected, so that they're communicating, and so that they really understand trauma. When you think about that description of the trauma-exposed child and how useful that could be for more teachers to understand those kinds of things when they see them in the child. Not that that necessarily means that the child has trauma exposure if they're acting spacey, but it certainly could be something that teachers could be thinking about and could know. And that's one of the things that Washington State's really pushing. So prevention is obviously key and the goal. We want this to not happen to anybody. But for those of us, or for children who have been exposed to trauma, what are sort of the keys to resilience, the keys to healing? One of those is to build the ability to cope with the intense feelings. So this and building a sense of safety are the things that have been, so that sort of these two things that are so important for the child caregiver relationship to be able to do, and that have more often than not been deeply disturbed or possibly destroyed in cases of childhood trauma. So helping the child develop the ability to cope with those intense feelings and to rebuild a sense of safety in the child's world. And hand in hand with that is the ability to tell the trauma narrative. So far too often, our experiences of trauma fall into the category of sort of things we can't talk about, things that we can't even think about, right? And in fact, that is not the path to healing. Sort of blocking it out of your mind is not, or just not talking about it and kind of brushing it under the rug is not the path toward healing. And it's not the path toward healing for our children. So even very, very young children, 2 years old, 3 years old, through drawing, through storytelling with dolls, can tell their story of what has happened to them. And that is very powerful and important. And in some therapeutic environments, that trauma narrative is sort of co-told by the caregiver and the child together, so that the caregiver can start to understand what the child's experience of this is. Because particularly, so say in a home where the primary caregiver is experiencing intimate partner violence, say, there is a desire to believe that the child doesn't know what's going on or isn't affected if it's not perpetrated against them. And that's not true, right? Similarly, in homes where the caregiver has difficulties with addiction or mental illness, there's a desire to believe that the caregivers are successfully sort of keeping the child unaware. And the research shows overwhelmingly that that's not the case. And so empowering the child to give voice to that which cannot be spoken is an important part of the healing process. And that's true for adults as well. It's just in childhood, with limited language and with limited sort of cognitive understanding, we have to do even more to create a safe space to allow the child to process and speak those, or express without words, their traumatic experiences. Some specific evidence-based therapeutic practices for children and adults who have experienced trauma include trauma-focused CBT. So CBT is cognitive behavioral therapy. And there is a trauma-focused CBT that is most appropriate for slightly older children, so say like 7 or 8 through adolescence, because there's a lot of language involved. And so a lot of developing skills, education for the parent, processing strong emotions, healing those bonds, but through dialogue and conversation. EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing treatment, can be used in children or adults and has sounds kind of bizarre maybe, but has really good evidence to suggest that it enables people to decouple the traumatic emotional reactions to the events that happened, and in that way begin to heal and move forward. And then for families where the child is under the age of 5 or 6, so really quite young and doesn't have sort of the linguistic and cognitive sophistication for something like trauma-focused CBT, there's something called child-parent psychotherapy, which is where the parent and the child together, or the caregiver and the child, meet with a therapist in weekly sessions, sort of a traditional psychotherapy model, but do process the trauma and rebuild the safe bond and relationship, the secure bond between the caregiver and the child. And so when I say these are some examples of evidence-based treatments or therapeutic possibilities, meaning that there have been research studies testing the effects with a control group and finding that these really do decrease the symptoms and the negative outcomes, at least in the short term, for people who have experienced trauma. All right. With that, I will say thank you. There's my email address at the bottom, so do sort of jot that down if you're interested in talking more, learning more, and I will open it up to questions.
We have a few questions considering the ACEs statistics and pie charts. Can you speak to the age group of people polled, if they were from random surveys, and if socioeconomic status makes a difference?
For instance, in the survey from Washington, like I have on the slide, it's a representative sample. So it's not a random sample. It was meant to capture the full range of socioeconomic status, different family compositions, different parts of the state, all of those kinds of things. So it was deliberately aimed to pull families to make sure that all parts of the state and all different family compositions, socioeconomic status, ethnicity, etc., were represented in those numbers. Both the original ACEs study and others that have come out afterwards, those effects of ACEs on physical and mental health, those odds that you saw in that figure, are controlling for education, socioeconomic status, use of smoking and exercise and other kinds of health behaviors. So those effects are above and beyond a lot of the things that we know can explain differences in health outcomes, right? Access to healthcare. So all of those kinds of things are already taken into account when we look at the differences between those people who reported 0 and those people who reported 4 or more.
This question is regarding why negative health outcomes happen to people with ACEs. It says, are the negative health outcomes symptomatic of the ways that people cope, like smoking to relax in the face of trauma leads to lung cancer, or eating to satisfy emotional discomfort?
Yeah, so there's definitely a component of that, right? So there's definitely part of what this association between ACEs and physical health outcomes is partly things like just described, things like sort of self-medicating with alcohol or cigarettes or drugs that then have their own negative consequences down the line, or food for that matter. But that's not all the relationship. there is a huge part of disassociation that is not explained by behavior, that is explained by biological processes, physiological processes that are changed as a function of trauma. And that's what I was starting to say, like the research is still emerging in this. And well, so we're going to continue to know more and more over the coming years. But the information that we do have out there shows that the people who have experienced early adversity, or ACEs, on average, this is of course no individual person, but when we look at averages of group of people who have experienced, multiple ACEs versus those who have not experienced ACEs, we see differences in brain activation. So there's neural differences. We see differences in the functioning of the immune system. We see differences in the functioning of neuroendocrine system, the stress response system. So yes, part of it is behavior, and it can be kind of like a feedback, spiral. But part of it is that these experiences in early life change biological systems that then develop along a different sort of trajectory, a trajectory that puts you at greater risk for disease and disability.
I'm curious about ACEs from a generational standpoint. Do 20-year-old adults have different ACEs reported than 50-year-old adults?
That is a good question. And I don't know that I have a good, so if I have a study that I can immediately bring to mind, sort of answers that. So the first real time that this was studied in a real scientific way was in the mid 90s. So those are, that's the generation that was, 40, 50, 60, 70 at that time. There are studies that have been done. The one I reported was from 2009, but I can think of another one that's coming out in 2012. And so in that case, the people who are 40s, 50s, 60s in midlife and reporting on their childhood trauma and their health are of a different generation. And so far, the pattern seems to suggest that on average across the population, or across every representative sample from a state, we're not seeing dramatic differences in the rates of traumas from people who were middle-aged in the 90s versus people who are middle-aged today.
In regards to the behaviors of a trauma-exposed child, will behaviors persist if untreated, and will they remain into adolescence and adulthood?
If we don't receive support and care, if we don't receive help for other ways to manage the trauma that we are experiencing, then we will continue to use the best strategies that we have available to us, which are oftentimes not the most adaptive, or not, are going to have a lot of other problems across different settings. So there are lots of instances of resilience. There are lots of people who have, this is always averages. There are lots of people who have had traumatic experiences and have had post-traumatic growth, who are very resilient in the face of these traumatic experiences. But I think that, like, recognizing that, we still want to make our mission to provide services and care for children and adults who have experienced trauma. Right? So we want to really recognize that we will all tend to use the tools we use the tools that we have to get by, right? And if we have experienced early trauma and we don't have the best tools, those are still the best tools that we have. So until we have new tools, more adaptive tools that will help us cope better across different situations and really thrive, we're going to do the best we can with what we have. And so as a community, our job is to get people better tools, right? Is to help them heal and develop better ways of managing for their own sake, and also to stop the intergenerational transmission of maltreatment, right? So if you have experienced early early trauma or adverse childhood experiences yourself, you're more likely to raise a child who is also going to experience adversity. And so to stop that cycle of maltreatment, that cycle of mental illness, that cycle of abuse that can happen if there isn't intervention.
Does the trauma need to be ongoing, or are isolated events also able to change social, emotional, cognitive, or physical behaviors?
So ongoing trauma is certainly more disruptive than single incidents, right? Um, and particularly when we look at that list of 10 adverse childhood experiences, if you experience some of those things at one point in your childhood, it's fairly likely that those were things that you experienced over some period of time, right? There is usually not a single episode of violence between caregivers just once and then never again. It tends to be repetitive. At the same time, a traumatic event, like say the loss of a caregiver, the loss of a parent, right? So traumatic grief at the loss of a caregiver can have really powerful effects, and certainly deserves the same kind of intervention and support that any other kind of traumatic event in childhood deserves. They're slightly different. So there's a specific traumatic grief version of trauma-focused CBT, for instance. So I think the answer is yes, a single traumatic event can have negative impact, and certainly it deserves intervention. It often doesn't have the same level of impact as something that is chronic, something that is ongoing, right? Because it is that experience of not being able to find a safe place, not having anywhere to go to escape the trauma day after day that really overwhelms the child's developing brain.
Besides stopping ongoing trauma and chronic stress, what therapies are most supportive of resilience?
So trauma-focused CBT and EMDR are both or regular CBT are both interventions that can be used by individuals who are no longer experiencing trauma, like it's in their childhood, it's in their past, but who are still feeling the effects of it, right? So we can have so if we've experienced childhood trauma, say, and one of our coping mechanisms was this dissociation, was this sort of like zoning out and just leaving our bodies and getting away from the situation when something awful was happening to us, that becomes one of our coping mechanisms. And that means that into adulthood, when something really stressful happens, your mind and your body sort of goes to that as a good strategy to use to get through this stressful event. And so we can have episodes of dissociation in adulthood. And so, or we can have flashbacks, right? Like a post-traumatic stress kind of flashback to around certain people, certain smells, certain environments, certain things that remind us of these things from our past. So the same kinds of trauma therapies that can be used in childhood or with families can also be used by people who are carrying the legacy of those earlier traumatic experiences, even if they're not living through something like that right now.
If a child is speaking about things that they are being conditioned to not talk about, could that potentially put them in danger? I'm confused on how you would make a child feel safe without removing them from the home. Can you please explain this?
So this is a really difficult question of when you have a child who is experiencing maltreatment in the home, the question of whether you remove them from the home or not. And certainly, and I think it really is a case by case situation, in part because the disruption of the attachment bond between the caregiver and the child, even though the caregiver is maltreating, is a huge rupture for the child. It's a huge loss, and so that needs to be thought about. So in the examples that I was giving of intervention and like letting children giving voice to these things that can't be spoken, right? It was really, I was describing examples of where the caregiver and the child have come together into therapy, into a clinical intervention. And so there is some buy-in from the maltreating caregiver to change the situation. Now, sometimes this is, so I've worked with populations where this is a mother, a female caregiver who's in an intimately violent relationship, and they may not be ready to leave their violent partner, but they can be motivated to go to therapy with their young child to keep their child safe and to sort of start to understand what the impact of their romantic choices are having on their child. But child-parent psychotherapy has been used with caregivers of very young children, so like under age of 3, who are actively maltreating, and the process of going through that and helping the parent come to understand the impact of their actions on the child. And what we think part of what's really happening is we're building a sense of empathy for the child in the parent. Can have, so in randomized controlled trials, that therapeutic intervention, letting, even a very young child sort of express their trauma, and the therapist helping the parent see what the child is expressing and understand what the child is expressing, can improves the quality, like the security of the caregiver-child relationship, changes the cortisol response, so the stress response of the child, even up to a year or more later. So the child has less of the really overwhelming biological stress response and decreases maltreatment. So that's, I think, some of the most like hopeful kind of things that can happen, is to actually heal that relationship. Of course, that's not always possible, right? So I think our goal is always kind of get families into treatment together and to heal those bonds, and to change that traumatic environment. But that's not always possible. So sometimes what has to happen is for the child to be removed from that environment. And like I said, that's a case by case kind of decision that has to get made. But when a child is in a safe space, whether that is the therapeutic room setting with parent, or whether that is in a foster situation because they have been removed from the home, the child needs to be able to tell their story. The child needs to be able to feel safe enough to tell their story, and to feel like there are adults, caregivers around them who are strong enough to hear their story and to hold their pain and to allow the child to process what they've been through. So yeah, that's probably not going to happen in a home with active maltreatment where the parent is not invested in getting any kind of intervention. But oftentimes the reunification process can be a change point for families. So after a child has been removed, but then in the process of reunifying, in the original, the bio parents getting their custody of their child back, can be a point at which they're really motivated to engage in some kind of intervention and really change things and enable them to keep their child in the home.
Thank you, Dr. Waters. Our next question asks, if childhood trauma is a catalyst for a behavior or dissociative disorder, what aspect should be addressed or treated first?
Interesting question. So yeah, so dissociative identity disorder, which is what used to be called multiple personality disorder, but is now called dissociative identity disorder, is understood currently, like the current psychiatric conceptualization of this diagnosis is that it very often comes out of early childhood trauma and is a product of the fragmenting of the child's psyche as a way to survive. extreme trauma, extreme abuse. So raising awareness of this is, I think, really important, because there are lots of therapies that we can get out there, right, when we're struggling with something. And if you know that you have childhood trauma, and that perhaps things that might be dissociative identity disorder or something along those lines, things that might be borderline personality disorder or something along those lines, as well as depression and anxiety, may have its roots in childhood trauma, then you want to be sure that you find a therapist who is trained in trauma and who has a trauma-focused approach to their therapy, because retelling the stories of your traumatic childhood without the sort of proper therapeutic process can itself be re-traumatizing. Can be a way that triggers post-traumatic flashbacks, and can be its own way of sort of bringing you back into those experiences, like biologically, physiologically in your body. And so that's part of what we really want to be able to do, is raise awareness of how many things can be impacted by childhood trauma, so that we can get therapeutic support from people who have that trauma training and who are trauma informed, because it's really important to build, just like we do with children, but it's just as important in adulthood, is to build a safe space and to build the abilities to cope with these overwhelming emotional experiences before we unpack and tell the trauma narrative. And so the therapist's job is to really and a trauma-informed therapist will know how to do this well, is to build that safe space and help the person build skills to manage their overwhelming feelings before they really start going through that Pandora's box of experience. So ultimately, the trauma needs to be shared, it needs to be processed, it needs to be sort of neutralized by being brought out into the open. But doing that too soon, or doing that in a way where you don't have those supports around you, can itself be a traumatic experience.
What types of resources do you recommend for a caregiver who has anger and/or temper issues which are negatively impacting a young child? And does arguing and/or yelling equate to an ACE?
Arguing between caregivers, yelling at a child, I think any parent is probably guilty of that at some point. I don't think that we can say across the board that qualifies as a trauma or an adversity. What makes it a traumatic event is when it is ongoing, and so, like in the case of arguing or fighting or yelling at your child, when it is ongoing and when it really undermines the child's sense of safety. So everybody fights and everybody yells at their child sometimes, but the difference between what undermines a child's sense of safety is when there's no real reparation. There's no real kind of coming back together and reestablishing that bond and knowing that you love each other and that, yeah, you fought, yeah, you yelled, yeah, it was ugly, and we're okay. We can yell and still love each other. And that has to be a really authentic experience. Children are really good at picking up things like stonewalling, the cold shoulder, or like the ugly non-speaking tension that can happen between parents or caregivers, and they're like, we don't want to fight in front of the kids, so we're just kind of like sort of low level hostile ignoring each other kind of thing. Kids pick up on that. Kids are very sensitive to that kind of emotional climate in the home. And so it's that coming back together in a way that is authentic, in a way that is like truly held and connected, and shows that's actually what kids need more than anything, rather than like never getting yelled at or never witnessing fighting, because that's just not the reality of life, is actually the seeing the full arc, right? That we can get really mad at each other and things can get really, nasty for a minute, And then it can come back and be really loving again. And experiencing that sort of full cycle of a relationship, like that's what's going to enable kids to be successful in their own relationships, is the coming back together, right? So yelling or fighting in itself is not what's going to be traumatic. It's when there is no coming back together, when it is relentless, when there's no time at which the child really feels safe again and is soothed. And it's just, the fear and the upset of the fight. And then there's kind of like things toned down, but they're not really okay, or you're not really sure if they're okay. And then it turns into another big fight, and that escalation where they never really get to come back to a place of safety. That's where things become really problematic. And that's where, getting support, mental health services for the caregiver, getting support, mental health services for the child. And when a child is young, like certainly under 5, but maybe even older, mental health services for the child means mental health services for the relationship. Like it means the parent and the child going to services together, as well as potentially the parent getting the couple or the parent getting their own sort of support, so that they can process, like, what is it that is so kicked up inside of them that they're angry, that they're lashing out, that they're not able to manage their emotions. They may have their own traumatic history. They may have some really real, really raw stuff going on inside their own psyche that is, stopping them from being able to be more gentle and empathic and understanding with their child, and they deserve to have that held and soothed and healed as well.